He noticed her before he knew he had. She wasn't the type a crowd would part for. There were no glints of youth chasing her steps, no bright-eyed aura of invincibility that girls his age seemed to carry like perfume. But there she was, standing by the cracked glass door of the coffee shop, trying to balance her coat, a book, and what looked like 3 tangled bags, and for a moment, she looked like something from a different frequency. Almost broken, entirely human, and so wildly out of sync with the curated backdrop of campus cool that he couldn't look away. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was curiosity, like catching a piano chord out of tune in a song you thought you knew by heart. Liam, 23, senior, art history major with a borderline failing GPA and a head full of unfinished sketches, wasn't someone who believed in fate. Coincidence, sure. Impulse, absolutely. But something made him hold the door open for her that day. She mumbled a thank you, barely meeting his eyes, then nearly tripped over her own feet trying to get inside. It would have ended there, just another harmless flicker of kindness. But he turned back 5 minutes later when he realized he'd left his sketchbook and saw her still standing in line, biting her lip like she couldn't decide whether she could afford a latte or not. He did it without thinking, slipped a 20 to the barista and muttered, "Whatever she wants, I've got it." He was halfway out the door when her voice called out, firm and clear, slicing through the low hum of conversation. "Hey, you." He turned. She was staring straight at him, eyes sharp but not unkind. "Why?" He shrugged, suddenly feeling every bit of the immaturity his stubble tried to hide. "You look like you needed a win. That should have earned a roll of the eyes. Maybe a scowl. But something happened instead. A crack appeared, not on her face, but behind it. A genuine, breathless smile fought its way to the surface, like it had been buried under years of dust, and finally saw daylight. She laughed. Not politely, fully, with sound and surrender. "Well," she said, stepping forward, accepting the cup now placed in her hand. "That's a first." The next hour vanished like a skipped page. They shared a booth with chipped corners, and she introduced herself as Elise. Just Elise. No last name, no job description. He learned she was 42, twice divorced, and currently crashing at her sister's place while waiting for her life to stop burning to the ground. He didn't ask why. She didn't explain. Instead, they talked about nothing, and then everything. Books they both lied about finishing, music they secretly hated, cities they wished they'd been brave enough to move to when it mattered. He noticed she never said kids, or husband, or my own place. She noticed he wasn't pretending to be cooler than he was. When they finally stood to leave, she hesitated. "This was nice," she said, folding her arms like she regretted the honesty already. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, half joking. She shook her head. "You're too young to waste time with someone like me, but not too young to buy your coffee." A pause. Then, with a weary smile, "Maybe just the coffee." They met again the next day, and the next. No names exchanged beyond firsts, no numbers, just the strange rhythm of 2 people orbiting the same booth. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. But it was something, and it moved fast without looking like it moved at all. Until that night. It was raining, the kind of steady rain that blurred streetlights and soaked through denim. He found her outside, fumbling with a broken umbrella. Without thinking, he reached out and pulled it from her hands, tossing it aside. "That thing gave up," he said. She laughed again. That rare, real sound. And he stepped forward, taking off his hoodie and draping it over her shoulders without asking. For a second, she froze. Not from the cold. From the closeness. From the undeniable warmth of being noticed. "You're going to freeze," she whispered. "I'm warm enough," he replied, watching her eyes for hesitation. And there it was again, that smile. Not practiced. Not grateful. Just alive. The first real one, she later told him, in over 7 years. Then they stood there, under gray skies and flickering lights, both of them soaked and shivering, and somehow warmer than they'd been in years. It changed quickly, not with a declaration, but with the way their silences started to feel familiar. What began as spontaneous coffee meetups turned into planned escapes, with both of them arriving early and pretending it was a coincidence. Liam stopped pretending he didn't care when she didn't show up one Friday. He sat alone in their booth, sketchbook closed, watching the door until it became obvious she wouldn't walk through it. When she did show the next day, her face was drawn and quiet. She didn't explain where she'd been. He didn't ask. He just slid her cup across the table and said, "I waited." And for a moment, she looked ashamed that someone still would. They weren't dating, not officially. Neither of them said the word, and yet every moment between them was a decision to keep choosing each other without explanation. He didn't tell his friends about her, mostly because there was no angle to make it sound acceptable, and she never mentioned him to anyone, likely because there was no space in her life for that kind of complication. But secrecy, like anything constant, wears down the edges of comfort. Liam began noticing the shift first, not in Elise, but in himself. He'd walk around campus and feel the distance. People his age filled spaces with loud certainty and plans stretched 10 years ahead, while he was sinking into something too quiet, too present, too real to ever be discussed out loud. She told him once, in a low, even voice, that her last relationship had ended with the man calling her baggage with a nice smile. She had said it as if reading from a fact sheet. Liam didn't respond at the time, just reached across the table and flipped his sketchbook to a page he had been hiding, one that captured her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, half tensed as though deciding whether to hold on or let go. "That's how I see you," he said. She stared at it for a long time before quietly folding the corner of the page and saying, "Don't romanticize me. I'm not an idea. I'm not something you rescue." He didn't stop seeing her. Elise lived in a part of town that Liam had only seen while riding his bike past the houses during sunset rides, places with locked gates, quiet gardens, and security cameras that made visitors feel like intruders. Her sister's house was cold in the way that expensive places often are, neat but soulless, everything in its right place, but nothing worth noticing. When he visited, he never stayed long. She'd meet him at the back door, wearing jeans that didn't fit right and an old sweatshirt that made her look closer to his age, but the air always felt heavy with caution. She didn't kiss him inside that house. Not once. It was a Monday afternoon when it all cracked open. A letter had arrived for Elise, handwritten, no return address, and she opened it in front of him because she didn't want to read it alone. The handwriting was sharp and angular, almost too perfect, and the message was short. "You're not invisible. People talk. He doesn't belong to you." She stared at it for a long time, her face unreadable. Then she placed it down carefully beside the coffee cup, as if it were something fragile and poisonous at the same time. Liam didn't speak. He didn't ask who had sent it. He already knew that whoever wrote it was someone who had seen them somewhere they shouldn't have been. Elise looked at him finally, not angry, not afraid, just tired. "This was never going to be sustainable," she said, not with bitterness, but with a calm certainty that felt worse than blame. Liam leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "We haven't done anything wrong." Her expression didn't change. "That's not how people will see it," she replied. "A woman my age with a guy who's still in college? They don't see what we are, they see what fits into their little story." That night, he didn't go home. They stayed at a motel 15 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with flickering hallway lights and stains on the curtains. It was the first time they had a space that was entirely theirs. There was nothing beautiful about it, but it was honest. They lay in silence for a long time afterward, both staring at the cracked ceiling as if it held answers. Elise reached for his hand, laced her fingers with his, and said, "I don't want to disappear again." He squeezed her hand tighter. "Then don't." But in the days that followed, she stopped showing up at the cafe. Her number, which she had finally given him in a quiet moment of trust, went straight to voicemail. His texts weren't delivered. He went to her sister's house once, stood across the street and stared at the windows, but there were no lights on, no car in the driveway. It was like she had erased herself. Liam sat in their booth every day that week, buying 2 coffees and letting one grow cold in front of him. On the 6th day, the barista, a sharp-eyed grad student who had seen them together too many times, slid a note toward him. "Someone dropped this off for you," she said. No explanation, no context. Just a folded page, and inside, Elise's handwriting. "This isn't about shame. It's about survival. Please don't look for me." He crumpled the note, but didn't throw it away. Liam didn't stop going. He returned to the coffee shop every evening at 6, ordered the same drinks, and sat in silence until closing. The regulars began noticing. The barista stopped asking for his order. A few students whispered near the window when they thought he wasn't listening. He heard them anyway. The words didn't bother him. They just didn't matter. What mattered was that she had written, "Please don't look for me," which meant she knew he would try. She still knew him. She hadn't deleted the idea of him from her life, just removed the contact point. That was enough for him to wait. He didn't have a plan. He had a need. 2 weeks passed before he heard her voice again. It wasn't in person. It came through the phone speaker, late at night, when his screen lit up with an unknown number. He didn't hesitate. "Where are you?" was the first thing he said. She didn't answer that. Instead, she said his name the way someone says it when they aren't sure they have the right to anymore. Her tone was careful, not distant, but not safe either. "I thought maybe if I stayed away long enough, it would feel like it didn't happen," she said. He sat up in bed, the room dark except for the glow of the screen. "Did it feel that way?" he asked. She was quiet for so long he thought the call dropped. Then, no. It felt worse. He didn't push her. He just listened as she admitted she'd gone to stay with a friend in a nearby town. Someone who didn't ask questions and didn't care about the gossip floating around Elisa's old neighborhood. It turned out the letter wasn't a one-time warning. There had been 2 more, each more direct. One slipped under her sister's door, the other taped to her car. They didn't include names, but the message was clear. Someone was watching, someone didn't approve, and someone wanted the relationship to end. Elise had panicked, packed in the middle of the night, and left without saying anything because she thought leaving was the only way to protect what was left of her dignity. He didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just said, "I still want to see you." Her voice cracked at that. "Then you can. But not there. Not where anyone sees." They met again 2 days later, not in the city but in the woods outside of it, at a clearing by the lake that she remembered from her teenage years. It was remote, quiet, and hidden behind an old parkway trail that no one used anymore. She brought coffee in a thermos. He brought his sketchbook, though he didn't draw. They sat on the dry grass and looked at the still water, neither of them needing to speak immediately. When she did talk, it wasn't about the letters or the rumors. It was about herself, about the mistakes that no one saw when she smiled the right way, about the years she wasted trying to make unhappy people stay, about the men who only loved her in secret and the friends who only stayed when her life looked presentable. She didn't cry, but her hands never stopped fidgeting. Liam listened without interrupting, but when she finally looked at him for a reaction, all he said was, "You talk like you're waiting for me to take it all back." She didn't respond. He stood up, pulled her with him, and held her close with both arms around her waist, not as comfort, but as proof that he was still there. "I'm not leaving," he said into her shoulder. "And if someone else has a problem, they can look me in the face and say it." The next few weeks were quieter. They met at odd hours, in hidden places, late-night diners, the rooftop of a library, the edges of forgotten parks. The secrecy wasn't romantic. It was tense, full of planning and watching over shoulders, but it made every moment real because nothing was automatic. Every choice was deliberate. Every word carried weight. They started talking at night, long hours over the phone, always after midnight when the world slowed down. They didn't talk about the situation. They talked about their worst decisions, their best lies, the first time they realized adults didn't actually know what they were doing. Elise once admitted she used to sit in her car after work and scream when no one was around. Liam told her about the time he nearly dropped out of college after failing a course he never told his parents about. Their voices softened the longer they stayed on the line, until it felt like they were falling asleep inside each other's thoughts. One night, Liam brought up the idea of leaving town. Not permanently, not in some dramatic escape, but just a weekend away where no one knew either of them, and there were no eyes waiting to report back to anyone. Elise didn't reject the idea. She just said, "We won't be invisible forever." He answered without hesitation, "Then let's be visible where it's safe." They planned for the weekend after midterms. A cabin outside the county, booked under a fake name, paid in cash. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. She didn't either. It was supposed to be 2 days of air without tension. The first day passed exactly like they hoped, quiet, slow, uneventful. But on the second morning, after breakfast and a long walk through the woods, they returned to find a car parked at the edge of the property. Not one they recognized. There was no one inside it, but a single figure stood far enough away to pretend not to be watching, yet too still to pretend they weren't. They didn't approach. They didn't speak to the person. Elisa's entire body went rigid. Liam stepped forward, but she grabbed his wrist tightly and shook her head. The person turned and walked back into the car without a word. But the message had been sent. They weren't hidden anymore. The following Monday, Elise showed up at Liam's apartment without warning, something she had never done before, and it threw off the balance they had worked so hard to keep. She didn't knock twice. She stood inside the hallway like someone who had walked into the wrong life and didn't know how to leave again. Her arms were crossed, face pale, eyes focused on everything except him, and it took him several seconds to close the door behind her because he understood before she spoke that something irreversible had happened. She didn't sit down. She didn't take off her coat. She just stared at his desk, at the stack of papers next to his half-open laptop, and said, "My sister knows everything now." Her voice was sharp, like she needed to keep it that way to stop from shaking. He didn't react immediately. He moved to speak, but she held up one hand like that alone would stop what was coming next. "I didn't tell her. I didn't need to. Someone sent her screenshots of us, from your social media, from some blog post you're tagged in, from campus forums I didn't even know existed. She read through them this morning before I woke up." She didn't even look surprised. Liam sat on the edge of the armrest, trying to read her tone, not because he didn't believe her, but because he didn't know if this was the beginning of an ending. Elise finally looked at him, the stiffness giving way to something angrier. "She told me I'm selfish, said I should be embarrassed, called you a child with no understanding of the consequences of what I'm dragging you into. She asked me if I even cared about your reputation or whether I was just too lonely to see the damage I was causing." Liam's expression didn't change. His jaw tensed, but he didn't argue yet. He waited. Elise took a step closer, then another, the frustration rolling off her in waves. "She said you'd walk away when it got hard, like every other man I've ever let get close. She said this would be just another pattern I'll pretend I didn't see coming." Liam stood up slowly, not defensive, just steady. "I'm not a child," he said. "I know what this is. I'm not some idiot who thinks the world's going to cheer us on. But none of that gives anyone the right to talk to you like you're defective. I'm here because I choose to be, not because you tricked me or used me or whatever story they want to tell themselves to feel superior. I'm not walking away." Elise didn't cry. She didn't move. But something in her shifted. He could tell by the way she let herself sit on the couch like she hadn't allowed herself to exhale in days. Later that week, Liam got a message from Julia, one of his friends from campus. It wasn't unusual for her to text him, but this message came without greeting, without emojis, without any of the casual tone she usually used. "You should know people are talking. You and Elise. It's not private anymore." He responded immediately. "What are they saying?" Her answer took longer than expected. "It's not just gossip. Someone posted photos. Someone called her your professor, which I know she isn't, but no one's correcting it. They're using words like predator. There's a thread with over 200 comments. You're being painted as some lost kid who got manipulated." That night, Liam went to Elise's house unannounced. He didn't text first. He didn't wait for permission. He stood on her front step and rang the doorbell until she opened the door wearing a robe and no makeup, her hair tied back, her eyes tired in the way that meant she had been reading things online she shouldn't have read. She didn't invite him in. She just stood there, framed by the doorway, arms wrapped around her waist, waiting for him to say something she didn't want to hear. "It's getting worse," he said. "They've made up their version. And it doesn't care about facts. It doesn't care that we weren't hiding anything filthy. They don't care that I'm not some fool who doesn't understand choices." "I told you this would happen," she whispered. "I told you we wouldn't get away with it." "Then let them watch," he replied. "If they're going to paint a picture of us, they might as well see the real thing." She opened the door wider. 3 days later, Liam took Elise with him to the department art exhibit, a formal event held in one of the campus buildings, hosted by faculty, attended by students and families. It was the most public space he had ever brought her into, and he knew exactly what it would cost. But he didn't ask. He told her it was time they stopped acting like what they had was shameful. She hesitated, not because she doubted him, but because she had spent so long being cautious that unlearning it felt unnatural. Still, she agreed. She dressed cleanly, simply, nothing designed to impress, and walked in beside him through the main entrance. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. No one said anything immediately, but the quiet wasn't subtle. It was sharp. He led her toward the corner where his sketches were hung, a series that included a new one he hadn't shown her yet. One where her face was fully visible, her smile unfiltered, the lines around her eyes drawn in honest detail, unapologetically alive. A woman near the faculty table leaned over and whispered something to a group of students. A few cameras lifted. Elise stood still, her hands folded in front of her, expression unreadable. Liam turned to her and said, "You can leave if you want." She didn't. She took a step forward, stood directly in front of the sketch of herself, and stared at it in silence. The murmurs got louder. The professor who hosted the event approached them slowly, clearing his throat, ready to ask a polite question with a judgment hidden underneath. Before he could speak, Elise said, without turning, "Yes, that's me." The man hesitated. She continued, "I'm not his professor. I'm not his boss. I'm not someone who tricked him. I'm just someone he sees clearly, maybe more than anyone else ever has." All eyes turned toward Liam. He nodded once and said, "That's the truth. If it bothers people, that's not our fault." No one clapped. No one spoke. But no one looked away. They didn't talk on the ride back. Elise kept her eyes on the road, both hands on the wheel, her jaw clenched just enough to make her silence feel deliberate. Liam sat beside her, his fingers twitching like he was trying to figure out what would be fair to say and what would only make things worse. They had just walked through the middle of every whispered opinion and let themselves be seen without explanation, but neither of them felt victorious. It hadn't changed anything. The crowd didn't riot. No one shouted. But the air around them was no longer neutral, and they both knew that once people saw you as a headline, they never went back to seeing you as a person. Elise pulled into his building's parking lot and turned off the engine, but she didn't move. Her hands stayed on the steering wheel, the keys still in the ignition, her body leaning forward like she was debating whether to turn back around and disappear for good. He didn't push her. He didn't beg. He waited, and when she finally spoke, her voice was even and low, like she was reading a verdict. "You should stop talking to me for a while." He didn't answer immediately because he knew arguing would only make her shut down faster. When he finally spoke, his tone was careful. "Is this about what happened, or about what people are saying happened?" She turned to him then, her expression almost blank, but her eyes sharp. "It's about the fact that you'll never get to be ordinary again. You'll always be the guy who dated the woman twice his age. That's how they'll see you, even if you go on to win awards or build a name. It'll always be the second sentence in the conversation. It'll always be part of the introduction. And that's my fault." He shook his head, leaning back in his seat. "It's not your fault. It's not anyone's fault. We didn't lie. We didn't cross any lines. We just existed in a way they weren't comfortable with." Elise pulled her hands away from the wheel and pressed them against her face. "Comfort matters. Careers are built on perception. You'll apply for grants, internships, residencies, and every time someone searches your name, they'll find a thread calling me predatory and you naive. That matters in the world you're about to enter. And I won't be the reason you don't get where you need to go." He stared at her, his voice rising now with something closer to frustration. "You think you're doing me a favor, but you're not protecting me. You're making the choice for me." She turned the key and opened the driver's side door. "You're right," she said. "I am." Then she stepped out, closed it behind her, and walked to the other side without another word. He sat there, unmoving, until she drove away without waiting for him to respond. For the next 2 weeks, he didn't see her. He didn't call, though he nearly did every night. He kept her name out of conversations. He stayed off the forums. He ignored the glances on campus. He stopped going to the coffee shop entirely. Instead, he threw himself into work, hours of sketching, writing, submitting portfolios he never expected to get responses from. It wasn't a distraction. It was what was left, the only thing he could shape without someone else's permission. One afternoon, he received an email from a gallery upstate. They wanted to feature his work in a summer showcase. They mentioned his piece from the university exhibit. They said they admired the honesty in the portrait. He closed the email without responding, unsure if the word honesty was supposed to sting or comfort. One night, he came home to find an envelope slid under his door. No name, no return address, just his first name written in her handwriting. Inside was a single page, torn from a notebook. It didn't explain anything. It didn't apologize. It just said, "You were right. I made the choice for both of us, but only because I wasn't brave enough to make it with you. I'm sorry that I couldn't stay." There was no way to respond. No number, no location, no ask, just her voice, printed on paper, and the silence that followed. Months passed. Rumors faded. New scandals arrived. Old stories became background noise. Liam's name was still occasionally linked to hers when people brought up the exhibit, but the comments no longer carried the same heat. Time diluted everything except the memory of it. He went to the gallery show. He stood in front of the same sketch, now framed and well-lit, surrounded by strangers who didn't know the history behind it. A woman asked him who the model was. He didn't answer. He just looked at the drawing, then looked away. Back in town, people had stopped asking about Elise. Her sister moved to another neighborhood. The house was sold. No one knew where Elise went. No one talked about her openly. Some said she'd moved to the coast. Some said she left the country. There were no confirmations. Just distance. Just quiet. He saw her once after that. Not in person. In a news article about a nonprofit project helping women re-enter the workforce. Her name was listed near the bottom of the piece. No photo. Just a sentence. Elise T., program director, former consultant, now focused on rebuilding. He stared at the sentence for a long time. He didn't print it out. He didn't send an email. He didn't search for more. It was enough to know she was still somewhere, still working, still existing. Liam didn't stop drawing. He didn't stop remembering either. Some nights, he would replay entire conversations in his head, not to hold on to them, but to prove they had happened. The silence between them wasn't final. It wasn't violent. It was just what had to happen when the world insisted their story didn't belong. It didn't take away the fact that, for a while, they had chosen each other. Without apology, without rehearsal, and maybe, somewhere down the line, if they were ever in the same city again, walking opposite directions through a crowded street, maybe one of them would look up first. Maybe there'd be a glance. Maybe a nod. Or maybe nothing at all. But that last question, what either of them would do if they saw each other again, stayed unanswered. Because not all stories get a final word. Some just wait.